In the harsh summer heat of mid-August 1861, coal miners gathered around the company store here in Eckley, Pennsylvania, to listen to a coal company clerk give a rousing speech about the restoration of the Union and support of the federal government. Those who listened to the speech cheered and clapped at its conclusion, announcing the formation of a brand new company of Pennsylvania volunteers. Hello, my name is Garrett Kost. I am a senior at Gettysburg College and a fellow with the Civil War Institute, and I am standing here at that very same location today in front of the reconstructed company store in historic Eckley Miners Village, Pennsylvania, just outside of Weatherly. This town in 1855 was no more than a simple outcrop of buildings, but by 1858, however, the land that was owned by Eckley B. Cox here was leased out to the Sharp, Weiss & Co. coal company for the construction of a colliery and a patch town. The colliery being that of the anthracite coal mine, the anthracite coal breaker where the coal is processed, and any other outbuilding that was needed for the actual process of mining coal. The patch town, however, is going to be that of the town where the miners' families would then be living. Within a year, about 30 double-family dwellings were constructed here in Eckley, along with a large wooden breaker, the mine outbuildings, a company store, and a hotel for guests. By 1861, however, this town population had surged to about 350, as anthracite coal mines created an abundance of jobs for the newly arriving immigrants of Ireland, England, Wales, and Germany. Though these living and working conditions were rather questionable, the miners continued their daily work of extracting this black anthracite coal from 200 feet or lower below the earth. As the American Civil War was announced, however, many of these miners saw an opportunity to break free from the lower rungs of the social ladder, as veteran status after the war allowed for much more freedom and much more social mobility than that of an anthracite coal miner. After that August speech, miners flocked to the enlistment table that sat astride the paymaster's counter here at the company store. This made every single miner here in Eckley, Pennsylvania contemplate the idea of soldierhood in order to receive more than their meager weekly wages. To the miners, soldiering was not necessarily unlike their current jobs. Working in teams to accomplish a dangerous task in uncomfortable environments with an ever-present prospect of death. Charles Foster, the company clerk that had presented that speech days to the initial beginning of the enlistment, was elected to be the captain of the company, and men rallied to fall under his command here in Eckley. The majority of the men from this company would be coming from Eckley Miners Village, while even more came from nearby Muck Chunk, or present-day Jim Thorpe, Weatherly, Whitehaven, or even Hazleton, Pennsylvania. With a total of 136 men on paper, this company, designated Company K of the 81st Pennsylvania Regiment, was marched off to Camp Curtin in Harrisburg and mustered into federal service on October 27, 1861. The 81st Pennsylvania then moved off to Washington, D.C., where the regiment was then billeted within the United States Naval Yards. The new year turned, and by April 4th, the 81st Pennsylvania was able to be set sail off towards Fort Monroe, where the 81st Pennsylvania and the men from Eckley took part in the Peninsula Campaign of the American Civil War. After the withdrawal down the peninsula, they continued to travel with the 2nd Corps of the Army of the Potomac to Antietam, to Fredericksburg, to Chancellorsville, and then finally to the Gettysburg Campaign of 1863. As the men from Eckley here marched and actually passed the border into the actual Keystone State, the men of the 81st passed by numerous wagons of wounded on July 1st, 1863. One of these wagons actually included the body of General Reynolds, who was killed during the furious first day of fighting. Although they had arrived too late in the day on July 1st to participate in the fighting of that day, the men slept on their arms nearby the present-day Pennsylvania Memorial on the Gettysburg battlefield. The next morning, the men cleaned their weapons and awaited very patiently to repulse a Confederate advance. It wasn't going to be until 4 o'clock in the evening on July 2nd, 1863, that the 81st Pennsylvania and the other men of Caldwell's division moved south to reinforce the embattled 3rd Corps, who was already in the fight of their lives for Devil's Den, the wheat field, and the peach orchard area. When the division passed by the James Weichert farm property, they began to see the remnants of the men in blue falling back further past them. Sergeant William Richards of Company K, an Eckley man, noticed, "The men withdrawing to our front looked to have seen and been in battle with ghostly spirits. These otherworldly threats, however, did not deter the men of the fighting Chippewa Regiment and Company K, as they shifted into a battalion line and stepped forward into the wheat field. While entering combat, they engaged Colonel Anderson's Georgians Brigade, pouring volley after volley into the oncoming rebels. After the lines of gray began to slowly withdraw, the color bearer of the 81st surged forward with the regimental flag. He urged the men to continue firing and to advance into the retreating rebels. This color sergeant, known affectionately to the men as Reddy McHale, was a sailor from Philadelphia and was well known to the men of Company K as a gambler and one who was not necessarily the most reliable to repay off his bets, but was exceptionally full of courage. Ever since Fredericksburg, when the original color bearer of the 81st was shot down 3 times when charging Marie's Heights, Private McHale at the time picked up the 81st colors and held them during the remainder of the withdrawal. Private McHale also had picked up another flag of the 132nd Pennsylvania, also escorting them out of the fighting as well. What set Private Reddy McHale apart, however, was his long, shaggy, unkempt red hair, which, during dress parades and formal functions, made him lose the privilege of color sergeant. During the Battle of Gettysburg, however, there would be no other for a superior choice of honor during that battle to carry the regimental flag. Reddy, along with the color guard, urged the 84th to advance. However, the color company began to surge forward as a Confederate volley felled not only Reddy, but the color company's captain and 2 other members of the color guard, halting their spirited advance. As the 81st Pennsylvania, however, held their position, they continued a limited role of pouring fire across the battle-swept wheat field. Shortly after this flag debacle, they had witnessed Colonel Cross with his famous red bandana become a casualty, allowing their very own Colonel Boyd McKean to rise to brigade commander. As the men looked to their right, they cheered as the famous Irish Brigade advanced into the Rose Woods, only to see them and Brooks' brigade streaming back out in horror not long after. The men of the 81st bent back its line in preparation for the onrushing hordes of Brigadier Wofford's Georgians. But as the men in gray advanced, however, the 81st began to fall back, retreating as they were out of water, ammunition, and the willpower to continue fighting. In approximately 2 to 3 hours of the fighting, the 81st Pennsylvania had lost 62 casualties, forever linking the men of Eckley to the fields of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The story of this men from this village did not necessarily end at Gettysburg, however, as more and more casualties were sustained throughout the war, as the men from the mining town of Eckley were wounded and replaced with easy manpower found from Reading and Pennsylvania. As Company K, however, went on throughout the war, this once enthusiastic, youthful group of miners that listened to Captain Charles Foster's rousing speech grew smaller and smaller. By February 1865, less than 10 of the original cast remained. One of these veterans, Sergeant William Richards, recalled his frustration as more and more the unfamiliar faces appeared around the old campfire. After Cold Harbor, Spotsylvania, and Petersburg, the 81st marched on, and by April 1865 they were engaged in their final campaign of the war. In one of the last engagements of the war, at Farmville on April 7th, 1865, the 81st suffered 82 casualties, including that of Sergeant William Richards. 2 days later, the American Civil War would end, but the men who had been with Company K and from Eckley returned to a town only to continue to perish in the anthracite coal mines below. Private Joseph Brooks from Eckley, Pennsylvania, returned home after refusing to re-enlist when the regiment needed to do so in 1864. Having returned home, he continued his job as an anthracite coal miner. However, on March 16th, 1865, a fall of coal collapsed within his workplace, crushing him and a laborer he had worked with. Even still, as these veterans returned home to the village, they were met with disdain, as past workers did not hail the veterans as heroes, but pawns of the coal companies and Mr. Lincoln who supports them. Despite the anthracite region being awash with anti-war, anti-abolition beliefs, the story of the 81st Pennsylvania and their 23 battle honors tells a different story. One where men from a troubled area united to fight under the United States banner and helped to carve out what little freedom they'd so desperately grasped for, even when 200 feet below in the mines of northeastern Pennsylvania.